Q&A. Yes.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Yeah.
What role do you see India having in relations with China and their rising power?
Yeah. Very good question. In the question of who can I get to help, right? Another way to think about the region is that you do have another big rising power that is actually a democracy, right? So India has resolved this question of who's going to how are you going to govern and how are you going to transfer power? Functioning democracy. A country with a lot of downsides in terms of its bureaucracy and so forth, but a rising population as well, which is generally a good thing for GDP. And back when we were in office, we sort of saw that piece coming. And we created a strategic plan for working with India. And the first thing we had to do was India had exploded a nuclear weapon in 1974. And as a result, there were all kinds of constraints and restrictions and sanctions against India for having done that. So we signed something called the Civil Nuclear Deal with India. And it really wasn't so much about getting civil nuclear power to India. It was really about removing all of those constraints. So now you actually have an enhanced and increasingly enhanced defense cooperation arrangement with India. People are again interested in doing business in India, partly because Prime Minister Modi has been clearing away some of the underbrush, but also because India is a sort of balance to China. And without saying it, I think you're seeing India become a part of a strategy for dealing with China. Now, some people will say it's a containment strategy. That's probably not the language you want to use. Is it a channeling strategy where you try to channel China in a more helpful way? But India has the potential to be a very big player in this. And so when you're asking the question, who do we get to help? If you've got a big, democratic, vibrant economy out there in a country called India that's stable, try to go there. Yes?
Thanks very much. We've heard a little bit today from you and previous speakers about democracy theory, the importance of democracy. I wanted to ask about working, especially when it comes to containing China, or whatever other word we're going to use, working with more troublesome partners, whether it's because they're undemocratic, or in the case of Hungary where they're democratic, but it's liberalism that's more in question. How do we work with them to fix their internal issues or let them go?
Good. If you think about countries on a democratic continuum, right, rather than they are democratic or they're not, at the extremes you've got a North Korea, which has nothing but a kind of, leader up there. And then you've got the true democracies, the United States, Britain, Europeans, India, et cetera. And then there are countries in between that are at sort of various stages of, let me call it, a more liberal circumstance. Some have gone back. Turkey would be an example of a country that looked like it was quite far along and actually has backtracked over this period of time. When you're confronted with this, if they're an ally like Turkey, you have a choice to make. Are you going to say, well, because they're not democratic or because they're backsliding, I'm not going to deal with them anymore? You're probably not going to do that. You're probably going to try to use whatever influence you can to encourage better behavior, better democratic behavior, but you're going to recognize that your tools are somewhat limited in a country like Egypt or Turkey. One of the hardest things to explain when you're secretary is, I believe in democracy promotion, but I do have to go meet with Mubarak, right? Or I believe in democracy promotion, but I do have to have Erdogan at the White House. Because the United States isn't an NGO. It can't be pure in these things. There are going to be times that you have to deal with allies that you would rather that they had a different kind of system. The best circumstances you're dealing with the Brits, right? They're democratic. That's great. Or for that matter, in other parts of the world, the Colombians, or in Africa, you're dealing with the Botswanans. These are all great democratic states. But most of the time, you're having to deal with countries that the democratic process is not what you would hope it is. You try to do what you can to encourage it, but you still have to have state-to-state relations. And I know there's a lot of talk about, quote, isolating Turkey at this point, particularly after their decision to buy Soviet military hardware. But isolate Turkey at your own peril. You probably have to continue to deal with them. The other thing I'll say about it is that if you don't continue to deal with them, you really think it's going to get better. You are probably better off to keep speaking out, but doing what you can to improve the situation. Let me look over here. Yes?
Thanks very much for coming to speak to us. I'd be really interested in what you think about European strategic autonomy or increased strategic autonomy in terms of your thoughts on the European Defense Fund, for example, its prospects, and whether it's actually a good thing for the US to have a more strategically independent Europe, not just talking about sort of 2% NATO spending, that kind of thing, but going beyond that and having a little bit of strategic autonomy.
Yeah. You know, as a former American Secretary of State, I want Europe to have all the capabilities, but not independence, all right? I mean, that's the way the American Secretary of State thinks about it. Gee, I'd really like them to have those capabilities, but when it comes to coordination, I really want the coordination to be with us. And I think from Europe's point of view, that's the best place to be, too. When you think about a couple of things that have happened recently with Europe, let me give you a couple concrete examples. The Iran problem, right? You have the Iran nuclear deal. Europeans are very wedded to it. President Trump comes in, says, I'm getting out of it. By the way, gave everybody a year. He didn't just withdraw immediately. And the Europeans said something that I think was a mistake. They said, well, we are going to give companies ways to get around the American sanctions to prop up the deal. I've been a corporate director. There's not a corporate director in the world that is going to take on US sanctions to preserve the Iranian nuclear deal. So don't say that, right? The European Defense Fund. I think once you've paid your 2%, I really like the idea that you'd have greater capacity in Europe. The problem is it's not happening. And when you have this, you know, when President Macron said, we may have to do our own devices, and I thought, come on. A French-German force is not going to terrify Vladimir Putin. So how about you reinforce NATO, which you only joined again some 12 years ago, but a defense component within that, that would be great if Europe would actually do more and had more capability to move. It was a sad thing in Libya when Europe ran out of ammunition on, I think, the third or fourth day. So I would love to see more defense capability, but I don't think it has to be at the expense of strategic coordination. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. So you kind of talked about the 1945 style system for establishing prosperity. And so given the realities of cyber and terrorist attacks and things today, do you think it would be best to try and modify and adapt the current system to fit those? Or do you think it's almost better to try and start anew and trying to combat and establish prosperity moving forward?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to do a little bit of both. So I've been very encouraged that NATO is trying to take on the cyber issue because it's already organized and it can work, I think, on those kinds of issues. But when you look at cyberspace, and by the way, I think the world is pretty well organized now on the terrorism front. We have tracking terrorist financing. We have the Proliferation Security Initiative, which can actually stop shipping if we think some cargo is there. A lot of new organizations kind of grew out of the 9/11 circumstance. The one that I'm most worried about, that we're really not organized at all, is how to deal with the issues around privacy and the internet. And it's a problem because for the first time, and that's not just privacy, it's of course what the Russians did in the election campaign and so forth. It's the first time that the battlefield, if you will, is not owned by the government. Right? The internet is a private, open entity. The US government doesn't own it, doesn't really have much control over it. It's the Facebooks of the world that control it. And so the problem is going to be people will overreact. Okay, then we have to control it. That's not going to happen. The Europeans are trying to control it. I would love to see if the Europeans and the United States were to get together and say, whatever differences we have over privacy and the openness of the internet, they pale in comparison to the way we in China see this. So something like the European GDPR, which is a set of rules about internet privacy, a number of companies are saying, well, they're actually not so bad, so why not try to build around that? So I think it's going to be bits and pieces. The truth is institutions rarely come up full-blown, and so I think you'll see people trying to piece it together. But the one that really doesn't have anybody talking about it in the proper way, because you've got to involve the private sector and governments, is the internet and how to deal with some of the downsides of it. Yes, right here? Yeah.
Thank you. So I've been thinking about democracy a lot recently. And you mentioned the democratic piece as an option. And as we were discussing this with I was discussing with some of the other students here the other day, and I've been wondering, is the democratic piece, in the way we think of it, a outcome of democracies themselves or a U.S.-led democratic order?
Yeah.
Right? Is it, the fact that democracies don't actually fight one another, or, if the U.S. withdrew more from the democratic order and there were more nationalistic-led parliaments, would they actually end up having conflicts? Maybe not large scale, but minor conflicts with one another. Does that make the democratic piece?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I would say that I would not have wanted to try that experiment in 1945, right? And withdraw the American shield for the democratic peace and see if the democratic peace between Germany and France or Japan and its neighbors would have lasted. So I think you needed both pieces. But now, institutions over time become sticky, and institutional relationships become sticky. And so now it's not really conceivable that France and Germany fight. It's really not conceivable that Japan attacks its neighbors, right? So what you need is a kind of de facto institutional arrangement, like American military power to shield the democratic peace. And then you give it time, and in time you have a de jure you start with a de jure, it's written down there, and over time it becomes de facto. Institutions over time, the norms just become the norms. But you don't want to rely on that at the beginning. So I think by now it's pretty entrenched. And even younger democracies that kind of came into it, I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern Europe was liberated, people worried that you might have war between Romania and Hungary over Transylvania, that you might have trouble between Bulgaria and Turkey over the Bulgars. Well, in fact, that system was able to absorb that. And so I think I'm not as worried now between democracies. I'm really worried about democracies and non-democracies. I have to tell you, the situation in Hong Kong today is challenging the Chinese Communist Party, but they've got one eye on Taiwan. And that's probably not a good thing that they have one eye on Taiwan. So it's a really excellent point. I just think over time, the norms become strong enough that you don't have to worry any longer. Even if the United States, I hope, doesn't withdraw, but if the United States is a shadow of what it once was. Let's see, let me go, how about you right here? Oh, okay, I meant you, but you can come next. Okay, right there and right here, yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
So how do you talked about three examples where there's a clear governmental adversary for the United States. In a situation like in the Northern Triangle, where there's not maybe necessarily a clear governmental strategy, and where the U.S. has perhaps had a historically destabilizing effect, how does that affect your decision-making process?
And tell me how you think the U.S. has added a destabilizing effect. Good. Go ahead.
At least the narrative would go from the Northern Triangle, the perspective of a Northern Triangle country, that in the 1980s our involvement in things like the Civil War in El Salvador negatively affected their ability to govern themselves.
Yeah. Well, let me just take the premise. Okay, I don't happen to agree with the premise, but let me take the premise, all right? And there's no doubt that there are times when U.S. actions have, in reality or in perception, added to tensions, and then that question, who else can I get to help, becomes even more important, right? So if you look at the history of Central America, and you look at the situation with the support for, the against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or you look at the support for paramilitary forces in Colombia at one time, out of Central America, but same sort of problem, you do have a history to deal with. We have a bit of a history to deal with in Venezuela, because I was National Security Advisor. We had nothing to do with the coup against Chavez, the attempted coup against Chavez. Everybody thinks we did, right? And so you do have these circumstances in which your own history can get in the way. And in Latin America in particular, not just in the Central American countries, but throughout Latin America, Manifest Destiny, Monroe Doctrine, the whole thing, there's been a sense of thinking of the United States as part of the problem. That's why it becomes even more important then to bring other big guys online and to have allies that you're dealing with. I can remember actually once saying to my Colombian counterpart, foreign minister, we were about to propose a particular Secretary General for the Organization of American States. I said, you propose it, not me, all right? Now, I want to say one word about Central America at this point, because we have this problem with refugee flows and asylum seekers, and until you deal with the problem in Guatemala, people are going to keep coming. And cutting off aid to Guatemala is not going to help when people keep coming. Colombia is an example of what happens when you actually go and help them deal with the problem. In 2000, Colombia was a failed state. The army and the police could not get into 30% of the country because of the FARC. When Uribe came to power, we said to him, are you willing to go after them? He said yes. We gave them military help, intelligence help. They destroyed the FARC, and now Colombia is a peaceful country. You're going to have to do the same thing with the violent gangs in Guatemala, because people are going to keep coming if it stays dangerous. But you make a good point. Sometimes the United States, because of its own history, is not in a good place. Let's see, let me go over here to you. Yeah, right there, yeah. And then you're next. Okay, yes.
Thank you so much. One thing that seems different also from 1945 is the rise of massive companies, usually tech companies like the big names Amazon, Facebook, and Google. To what extent should they be involved in these international organizations that exist, or their role in, I guess, maintaining this order?
Yeah, well, they definitely, I would argue, have a role in maintaining the order. I was just referencing, on the privacy stuff. I think they have to play a major role when you look at what problems, the internet has manifold benefit, all right, we see that. But when you look at some of the problems that people would not have seen coming, they're going to have to be part of the solution. One of the things I don't really understand is when they learned that Facebook platform was being used by the Russians in this way, why they didn't go and sit down with Mark Zuckerberg and say, look at how your platform's being used. Because you have to enlist them in those circumstances. I think you would not find that you need to have, they all, by the way, they all lobby heavily around World Trade Organization's issues and so forth and stuff like that. And part of the problem is, I think if you get them as a group, they're lobbying in different directions because they all want different things. I think you involve them where it's necessary to involve them. And in this entire area around the internet and how to think about its downside effects, they have got to be involved. The other place that they really need to be involved is on the human potential side. I've been saying to CEOs of companies these days, before you automate your workforce out of existence, how about you retrain them? Because if you keep automating people out of existence for job, and you get to the place that we continue to have what we have now, which is a huge difference between the unemployment rate and job seekers, that tells you there's a job skills mismatch. I can't fix that. They can. And so I think there are places that you involve them. And by the way, since that's the underlying impulse for populism, they can do a lot of good if they can deal with that. But I would do it sort of case by case. Yes, the lady behind you was first. Yeah, there she is, right there. Yeah.
Hi,
Yes.
thanks
Hi.
so much. Something like in addition to privacy that I see is this kind of international problem that might challenge our 1945 or 35 world order is climate change,
Yeah.
the potential for imminent mass migration. We're already seeing like conflict outbreaking in the Sahel, and I was wondering how you think we should be rethinking our structures to accommodate for something so transnational.
Yeah, and this is one which bumps up very hard against the need of sovereign states to provide for their people. So, if you tell India you have to shave 1% off your GDP to deal with your carbon footprint, they're going to tell you, not going to happen. One of the reasons that China has suddenly become so friendly to climate change is because it became a social problem internally. When people began realizing they couldn't breathe in Beijing, and the Chinese government was putting up particulates, or particulates that didn't bear any relationship to what they were seeing on a little app that people were carrying, and that the US government, you want to talk about smart policy, the US ambassador just had a little gauge that was showing what the particulates actually were. And so all of a sudden, the Chinese have a social problem. Now they're really committed to climate change and so forth. So the question is, how do you align that impulse of national states to grow the economy, which actually they have to do if they're going to provide, with the longer term, and not very long, but longer term impulse to do something about climate change? I actually thought that the Obama administration's Paris Accord was a good way of doing that. Why? Because unlike the Kyoto Accords back in the late 90s, which were built top down, this was built bottom up. So everybody came, and every answer to this question has to have the 3 E's. What is going to be my energy mix? What is going to be my economic policy? And what's going to be my environmental sustainability? And it's like a mathematical equation. You've got to get those 3 to work together to give you a good outcome. For some countries, that's going to take a little longer. So one of the things that I think we could do as a world, as opposed to now what national states can do, is if you just made all technological breakthroughs that have an effect on climate change tariff-free, this would be an incentive for countries to bring technology in a way that it would be quicker than if they're worrying, and it takes a little bit of the pressure off that economic piece and puts it into the environmental bucket. And so if you think of those as always needing to be in balance, you start to get some solutions to the issues. All right, I think I'm being told I have to go. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.